Commander Lisa Grant sat in her small ship and stared at the screen in front of her with confusion written across her face and her hands gripping the controls. Tighter than usual because something about this signal made no sense at all, and she had been flying through space for 15 years but had never seen coordinates like these before in her entire career with the Earth's defense. The distress signal had arrived 3 hours ago while she was doing routine patrol near the outer colonies, and it was encrypted with a code so old that her computer needed 20 minutes just to crack it open, and when it finally did, the message inside was almost blank, except for one set of numbers that pointed to a sector of space that every map called dead and empty and forbidden her. Commanding officers back at headquarters told her to ignore it and return to base immediately, but Lisa had always been the type of person who needed to know why and how and what was really going on. So, she plotted a course to those coordinates and jumped her ship into the darkness without permission or backup. The journey took 6 hours through hyperspace, and when she dropped back into normal space, her breath caught in her throat because floating in the void ahead of her was something that should not exist according to every law of physics and history she had ever learned. It was a structure made of crystal that glowed with soft blue light from within, and it was massive like a small moon, but shaped like a spiral tower that twisted up and down at the same time in ways that hurt to look at directly, and energy rippled across its surface in patterns that her sensors could not identify or measure properly. Lisa brought her ship closer, with careful movements and her heart pounding hard in her chest, because this was either the greatest discovery in human history or the worst mistake she would ever make, and right now both options seemed equally possible. Crystal structure had no doors or windows that she could see, but as her ship approached, a section of the wall simply dissolved into nothing and created an opening large enough for her vessel to pass through, and she hesitated for only a moment before guiding the ship. Inside, the interior was even more impossible than the outside because it seemed to be larger on the inside than the outside, and the walls were transparent, so she could see stars and nebulas all around. No. And the floor beneath her ship glowed with the same blue light that pulsed in rhythm. Like a heartbeat, she landed her ship on a flat platform and put on her environmental suit just in case and checked her weapon twice before opening the airlock and stepping out into the archive, because somehow she knew that was what this place was, even though no one had told her. The air was breathable according to her suit's sensors, and the gravity felt close to Earth normal, and the temperature was comfortable. But something about the atmosphere made her skin prickle. With awareness, like she was being watched by invisible eyes, then she saw her and Lisa stopped walking completely. The woman stood 30 meters away, near a pillar of crystal that reached up into darkness, and she was tall and impossibly graceful, with skin that seemed to glow faintly like moonlight on water, and her hair was long and silver and floated around her head as if gravity did not quite apply to her the same way it did to everything else. Her eyes were what made Lisa understand that this was not human, because they glowed with actual light, like captured stars, and they were watching Lisa with an expression that mixed curiosity and sadness and something else that Lisa could not identify. The woman spoke, and her voice sounded like music and breaking glass at the same time, and she was speaking in Galactic Common, but her accent was so old and strange that Lisa had to focus hard to understand the words she said. The throne has awakened, and it searches, and it has chosen wrong. Lisa opened her mouth to ask what that meant, but before she could speak, something else moved in the shadows behind the glowing woman, and Lisa brought her weapon up on instinct, and then froze again because what emerged was impossible. The dragon was real, and it was huge, with scales that were black like space itself, but they shimmered with colors that had no names, and its eyes were the same glowing white as the woman's eyes. When it moved the air around, it seemed to ripple and bend like reality was having trouble deciding what the dragon was made of. Creature coiled its body around the pillar where the woman stood and fixed its gaze on Lisa, and she felt like she was being examined down to her very atoms and judged by something far older and stranger than she could comprehend. The woman spoke again and said, "Do not fear, Vorthonyx, and he will not harm you unless you prove to be a threat." And then she paused and tilted her head and added, "But you are only human, so you cannot be much of a threat to anything that matters." That statement should have made Lisa angry. but instead it just made her more confused because the way the woman said it made it sound like a simple fact rather than an insult. Lisa lowered her weapon slowly and asked, "Who are you, and what is this place, and what throne are you talking about?" The woman stared at her for a long moment and then said something in a language Lisa had never heard before, and it sounded like wind through mountains and crystal bells ringing underwater, and the dragon made a low rumbling sound that might have been agreement then. The woman switched back to Galactic Common and said, "I am Keleth, the Ethel, though my people are gone now, and have been gone for longer than your species has existed. And this place is the last archive, and the throne is waking, and that means everything ends. Unless it can be stopped." Lisa felt like she was missing huge pieces of information, and she was about to ask more questions when the entire structure suddenly shuddered and the blue light flickered and went dark for 3 full seconds before coming back on much dimmer than before. Clith's glowing eyes went wide, and the dragon Vorthanax raised its head and spread wings that Lisa had not noticed before, and they were massive, and they seemed to be made of the same space black material as its scales. The elf woman looked past Lisa toward the opening in the crystal wall where her ship waited, and her expression shifted into something Lisa recognized immediately because she had seen it on the faces of soldiers right before a battle. They knew they could not win. She said, "They have found us, and they come to stop what cannot be stopped, and you must leave now, human, before they destroy you along with everything else." Lisa looked back toward her ship and then at Keleth and the dragon and made a decision that went against all her training and common sense, because she asked who was coming and why would they want to destroy this place through the transparent walls. Lisa could now see shapes moving in the darkness of space outside, and they were ships, but not like any ships she had ever encountered, because they were organical sleek, and they moved through space like sharks through water, and there were dozens of them. "Approaching Fesculeth," said the assembled, "and they are the ones who made the pact, and they guard the old laws, and they will kill anyone who seeks the throne or who even knows that it exists." Archive shuddered again, and cracks began to form in the crystal walls, and pieces started to break away and dissolve into nothing, and the blue light was pulsing faster now like a heart in panic. Vorthanax made a sound that was definitely not friendly, and smoke began to curl from his nostrils, and Keleth placed one glowing hand on the dragon's scales and spoke to him in that strange musical language, and he settled slightly, but his eyes never left the approaching ships, ran back to her vessel, and shouted over her shoulder for Keleth and the dragon to follow her if they wanted to survive, because she was not leaving without answers, and she was definitely not going to let whatever those ships were destroy the most interesting discovery humanity had ever made. A Kilth hesitated, and then she looked at Vorthanax, and the dragon looked back at her, and some unspoken communication passed between them, and then they both moved toward Lisa's ship with speed that seemed impossible for creatures of their size. Lisa got the airlock open and ran to the cockpit and started the launch sequence, and behind her she heard Keleth and Vorthanax entering the ship, and the dragon had to fold himself into a space that should have been far too small, but somehow he fit. The first weapon blast hit the archive just as Lisa's ship lifted off, and the entire structure began to collapse inward, and she pushed the engines to maximum and aimed for the opening in the crystal wall and hoped that her ship was fast enough. They burst out into space just as the archive imploded behind them, and the shockwave hit them hard, and alarms screamed throughout the cockpit, and Lisa fought with the controls to keep them from spinning out into the void. Organic ships were all around them now, and they were moving to surround her vessel and cut off any escape, and Lisa knew her small reconnaissance ship had no weapons that could fight off even one of those vessels, let alone dozens. Then Vorthanax did something that saved all their lives, and he moved to the back of the ship, where the engine core was located, and he opened his mouth and breathed something that was not quite fire and not quite energy onto the core, and suddenly the ship was moving 3 times faster than it should have been capable of moving. Lisa did not understand how that was possible, but she was not going to question it, and she plotted a jump to hyperspace and prayed that the dragon's enhancement would last long enough to get them away. Them assembled ships fired on them, and the shields took hits that should have destroyed them, but the journey to New Seattle took 2 days in hyperspace, and during that time, Lisa learned more about the history of the galaxy than any human had ever known, and most of it made her wish she could forget everything and go back to simple patrol. Missions where the biggest concern was smugglers and Pirate Escalith sat cross-legged on the floor of the cargo. Bay with Vorthanax curled around her like a protective barrier, and she spoke in her strange, musical voice about events that happened before humans had even discovered fire, and her glowing eyes grew distant as she remembered things that Lisa could barely comprehend. She explained that millions of years ago there were 12 great species that ruled different parts of the galaxy, and each one was powerful and ancient and convinced of their own superiority, and then the throne appeared. And no one knew where it came from or who made it, but everyone knew what it offered. The throne promised ultimate authority over all space, in all species, and the power to reshape reality according to the will of whoever claimed it. And naturally, every one of the 12 species wanted that power for themselves. And so, the Throne War Bagonkalith described battles that cracked planets in half and weapons that made stars explode and fleets so vast they blocked out entire nebulas, and the war went on for thousands of years, and the death toll climbed beyond counting, and entire civilizations that were not even part of the conflict were wiped out as collateral damage. But here was the terrible part that made Lisa's stomach twist with dread, and Keleth said it with such quiet sorrow that it was almost worse than if she had shouted. If the throne rejected every species that tried to claim it, every emperor and warlord and champion who sat upon the throne was judged unworthy and cast down, and the throne remained empty and mocking and untouchable, and yet none of the 12 species would stop trying because the possibility of ultimate power was too tempting to resist. Finally, after millennia of pointless death, the 12 species made a pact, and they agreed to seal the throne away forever and erase all records of its existence, and hope that future generations would never learn about it and never restart the Warcliths. People the Ethel were chosen as guardians because they were known for their dedication and their isolationist nature, and they agreed to watch over the throne's prison for all eternity, and make sure no one ever found it again. The dragon clans like Vorthanax served as an additional layer of security, and they used their natural ability to navigate the strange dimensions between normal space to hide the throne's location in a place where conventional ships could never reach for millions of years. The system worked, and the throne stayed sealed, and the galaxy moved on. And the 12 ancient species eventually faded away or evolved into something different, and the Ethel themselves dwindled down to just a handful of individuals, still maintaining their eternal watch. But 3 months ago, something changed, and Keleth's voice dropped to barely a whisper. When she talked about it, the throne broke its own seal from the inside. It should have been impossible, because the prison was designed to hold it forever, but somehow the throne simply decided it was done waiting, and it opened itself back up to the galaxy, and it began broadcasting a signal that Keleth could feel in her bones and her genetic memory. The signal was a summons, and it was reaching out across all of space looking for something, and Keleth had been desperately trying to understand what the throne wanted. When Lisa arrived at the archive now, they had to figure out what the signal meant, and more importantly, why the assembled fleet had appeared so quickly to try to stop them. Lisa brought her ship out of hyperspace at the edge of New Seattle's system, and she sent the proper identification codes, and was given clearance to land at the main settlement, which was built into a series of asteroids that had been hollowed out and connected with tunnels and transparent domes. She contacted her old friend Maya Collins, who worked as a xenarchaeologist at the colony's research station, and when Maya saw Keleth and Vorthanax, she actually fainted, and Lisa had to catch her before she hit the floor. After Maya woke up and stopped hyperventilating, she immediately started asking questions faster than anyone could answer, and she pulled out every scanning device she owned and started taking readings of Keleth and the dragon, while muttering about how this was impossible and how her entire understanding of galactic history was wrong. Maya was brilliant, and she had spent 20 years studying ancient civilizations, and she had written 3 books about pre-human, spacefaring species, but she had always believed that elves and dragons were just myths and legends that early humans had made up. Now, those myths were sitting in her laboratory and answering her questions and letting her scan their biological structures, and Maya looked like she might faint again from sheer excitement. Lisa left Maya and Keleth to work on translating more of the Ethel historical records, while she went to file a report with New Seattle's defense coordinator, because even hidden colonies needed to know when potentially hostile fleets were chasing refugees to their doorstep. But before she could finish writing her report, the alarms started blaring throughout the entire colony, and Lisa ran to the command center where dozens of people were staring at screens that showed impossible readings. The assembled fleet had found them, and they had brought more ships this time, and they were not bothering with warnings or negotiations, and communication came through on all frequencies, and the voice that spoke was cold and mechanical and utterly without mercy, and it identified itself as the Concordat, speaker representing all 12 successor species of the ancient powers. The message was simple and terrifying. Surrender the human called Lisa Grant. Within 1 hour, a New Seattle would be destroyed, and then every other human colony would be hunted down and eliminated until humanity was nothing but a memory. Lisa felt ice spread through her veins, because this was not a threat against her personally anymore, and this was genocide being casually announced like it was just a necessary task. Defense coordinator, whose name was Kate Morrison, looked at Lisa with hard eyes and asked, "What did you do to make them this angry?" Lisa explained everything as quickly as she could, and halfway through her explanation, Maya burst into the command center, dragging Keleth behind her, and Maya's face was pale and her hands were shaking. As she held up a data pad, she said, "I found something, and you need to see this right now, Anne." The data pad was a recording of the throne signal, and Maya had run it through every analysis program she had and cross-referenced it with every known biological database, and the results made no sense until they made perfect sense in the worst possible way. Signal's resonance pattern was specifically tuned to match human brainwave frequencies with 97% accuracy. Throne was not just broadcasting to the galaxy, and it was calling specifically to humanity. Kate Morrison swore loudly and asked, "Why would an ancient artifact care about humans when we have only been in space for 3 centurias?" Answered in her musical voice, and she said, "Because the throne judges not on age or power, but on something else, and whatever that something is, your species has it, and mine did not." Maya pulled up more data and showed them simulations of what the throne signal looked like when mapped in 3 dimensions, and it was beautiful and terrible, and it looked almost like a net spreading out across the entire galaxy with strands reaching toward every planet where humans lived. Lisa realized with growing horror that the throne was not just calling one human, and it was trying to connect with all of humanity at once, like it was preparing to run some kind of test or judgment on the entire species. The 1-hour deadline was ticking down, and Kate Morrison was already preparing evacuation protocols, but they all knew there was nowhere to run if the assembled were serious about hunting down every human settlement. Then Vorthanex, who had been silent until now, spoke in his thunder voice and said, "There is only one way to stop this." Everyone turned to look at the massive dragon who barely fit in the command center, and his glowing eyes fixed on Lisa specifically. He said, "You must go to the throne before the assembled can destroy it, and you must discover why it chose your kind and either accept its judgment or reject it completely, because those are the only 2 options that will end the signal." Keleth nodded slowly and said, "The throne is located at the galaxy's core in a place where normal space does not work correctly, and only dragons can navigate there safely, and even then it is dangerous." Lisa looked at the countdown timer that showed 40 minutes remaining, and then at the screens showing the assembled fleet moving into attack position, and she knew she did not really have a choice. She said, "If I go to the throne, will that stop them from attacking New Seattle?" The Concordat speaker's voice came through the communications again, as if it had been listening, and it said, "If you come to us now, we will spare this colony, but make no mistake. Human, your species has been chosen by something that must never choose anyone, and that makes all of you a threat to galactic stability." Kate Morrison grabbed Lisa's arm and said, "You cannot seriously be considering this." Lisa met her eyes and said, "What choice do we have? And if there is even a small chance that I can stop this, then I have to try." Maya was crying now, and she said, "This is not fair, and humanity should not have to pay for something we did not ask for." The journey to the galaxy's core took 3 days, following paths through space that should not exist, and Lisa's ship traveled through colors she had no names for and past stars that bent in directions that made her head hurt when she tried to look at them direct. The Vorthanax led the way, and his massive form moved through the twisted dimensions like he was swimming through water, and sometimes he would call out warnings in his thunder voice, and Lisa would have to adjust course to avoid things her sensors could not even detect. Killith spent most of the journey in a meditation trance, and her glowing eyes were closed, but Lisa could see energy rippling across her skin like she was preparing for something difficult and dangerous on. The second day, Lisa received a message from Kate Morrison back at New Seattle, and the news was devastating. Sembold had attacked 2 other human colonies while Lisa was traveling, and they had given no warnings and shown no mercy in both. Settlements were gone now, with all their people dead or missing. Kate's voice was tight with fury when she said, "They are sending a message, and the message is that they will destroy us, piece by piece. Until you finish whatever you are doing." Lisa felt guilt crashed down on her like a physical weight because people were dying because the throne had chosen humanity, and she was the one who had discovered the archive and brought this nightmare into the open. Kallith opened her eyes and looked at Lisa with that ancient sad gaze, and she said, "You cannot blame yourself for what the assembled choose to do, and they are afraid, and fear makes even wise beings commit terrible acts." Lisa wanted to scream at her that words did not bring back dead colonists, and platitudes did not stop genocide, but she kept her anger locked down because it would not help anyone right now. Instead, she asked Kallith why the Ethel went extinct if they were supposed to be guardians. For Vord, Kallith was quiet for a long time before answering, and when she did speak, her voice was even softer than usual. She said, "My people became obsessed with worthiness, and we spent thousands of years trying to understand why the throne had rejected us and what made a species qualified to claim it, and eventually we decided that we would make ourselves perfect." The Ethel changed their own biology and their culture and their way of thinking, and they isolated themselves from every other species because they believed contact with others would contaminate their purity. Kallith said, "It took 10,000 years, but my people succeeded in making themselves into what they believed was the perfect species, and then we approached the throne again and asked it to judge us. The throne looked at what we had become, and it rejected us even harder than before. Then before that rejection broke something in the Ethel, and they could not accept that all their work and sacrifice meant nothing to the throne, and so they went mad with rage and tried to destroy it. The throne defended itself, and in the resulting conflict, the Ethel were wiped out, and Kallith survived only because she had been away from the homeworld. When the attack happened, and by the time she returned, there was nothing left of her species except memories. She said, "I have been alone for 3,000 years, watching over the throne's prison and trying to understand what my people did wrong, and now I think I finally know." Alyssa asked, "What is it?" Kallith said, "We forgot how to be imperfect, and we forgot how to grow and change naturally. And we became so focused on being worthy that we lost the very things that might have made us worthy." The ship's alarms interrupted their conversation, and Lisa looked at the navigation display and saw they were approaching something massive. Through the view screen, she could see a structure that made the archive look tiny by comparison, and it was built around a cluster of black holes at the galaxy's center, and it glowed with light that came from no visible source. The throne was not a chair or a platform, and it was a web of crystalline pathways that connected to every star system and every planet that had conscious life, and Lisa could see the pathways stretching out across space like veins of light, reaching to infinite. Voithanek's voice came through the communication system, and he said, "We have arrived. And now you must decide, human, whether you will face the throne's judgment." Lisa brought her ship closer, and she could feel something pressing against her mind, like a presence trying to communicate but using a language that had no words. Scalith said, "The throne is already scanning you, and it is reading your memories and your thoughts and everything that makes you human." Lisa did not like the idea of something rooting through her mind without permission, but there was no way to stop it, and the pressure grew stronger until she felt like her skull might split open. Then, suddenly, she was not in her ship anymore. Lisa stood on a platform made of the same crystal as the throne's pathways, and all around her were like visions playing out like holographic displays, but they felt more real than that. And she understood that these were not recordings, and these were direct experiences downloaded into her consciousness. She saw humanity's history from the outside perspective, and she saw the wars and the atrocities and the countless times humans had nearly destroyed themselves and each other. She saw ancient Rome burning, and she saw the trenches of the First World War, and she saw nuclear weapons detonating over cities, and she saw spacecraft exploding in colonies, failing and people dying in ways both brutal and pointless. But she also saw the recoveries, and the compassion, and the stubborn refusal to give up. She saw humans rebuilding after every disaster and learning from their mistakes, even if it took generations. And she saw artists and scientists and ordinary people choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier. She saw humanity spreading to the stars, not as conquerors, but as explorers. And yes, there were corporations and military powers that wanted to exploit and dominate, but there were also teachers and doctors and engineers who just wanted to help. The vision shifted, and now she saw the 12 ancient species and their civilizations. At their height, they were magnificent and powerful, and their technology could reshape planets, and their knowledge spanned millions of years. But there was something rigid about them, and something cold each species had developed. Strict hierarchies and unbreakable traditions, an absolute certainty in their own superiority, and when they looked at other species, they saw only tools or threats. Never equals the throne showed her how each of the 12 had approached it, with demands rather than questions, and with assumptions of worthiness rather than curiosity about what worthiness meant. They had all failed the same test in different ways. Then the visions stopped, and Lisa stood alone on the crystal platform, and in front of her the throne manifested as a presence that had no physical form but filled her awareness completely. It did not speak in words, but she understood its communication. Anyway, it showed her a choice, and the choice was simple and terrible. She could accept the throne's judgment and humanity, to be granted stewardship over the galaxy, but with conditions that made Lisa's blood run cold. Humanity would be limited to a tiny fraction of their current territory, and every human action to be monitored by the throne's systems, and any sign of the aggression or dominance that the ancient species showed would result in immediate termination of the entire species. It was not leadership, and it was a cage dressed up as an honor. She could reject the throne and walk away and accept whatever consequences came from that rejection. Lisa thought about Kate Morrison and Maya Collins and all the colonists who had died because the assembled were afraid of what the throne might choose. She thought about the Ethel, who had destroyed themselves trying to be perfect enough to claim power they did not need. She thought about humanity's messy, chaotic, beautiful, terrible history, and how they had survived this long, not by being perfect, but by being adaptably. She made her choice. Lisa looked at the throne's presence, and she said, with all the defiance she could muster, that she refused. She said humanity did not come to the stars to be judged by ancient machines or to accept limits imposed by beings who thought they knew better. She said if the price of survival was giving up freedom, then humanity would rather face extinction on their own terms. Presence seemed surprised, and Lisa felt it searching through her mind again, trying to understand why she would reject what every other species had desperately wanted. Then something unexpected happened, and the entire structure began to shake. Crystal pathways started to crack, and energy began bleeding out from the fractures, and Lisa fell to her knees as pain shot through her. Headcliff's voice came from somewhere, and she was screaming that Lisa had triggered the collapse protocol. Isa managed to gasp out, asking what that meant. Keyleth said it meant the throne was never designed to be rejected by a chosen species, and Lisa's refusal had broken something fundamental in its programming, and now it was going to destroy itself, and take a large chunk of the galaxy with it. The visions around Lisa showed what would happen if the throne collapsed completely and entire. Star systems would be torn apart, and billions of lives would end, and humanity would die anyway along with everyone. Lisa struggled to her feet and shouted at the throne, asking why it would do this. Present showed her one final vision, and this one made everything clear in the worst possible way. The throne was not built to find a worthy species, and it was built to prevent galactic war by offering a false solution. The ancient precursors who created it knew that the mere existence of ultimate authority would drive. Lisa contacted Maya back on her ship and told her to get every quantum computing system online and to prepare for the most complex calculation humanity had ever attempted. And Maya asked what they were trying to do, and Lisa said they were going to rewrite reality itself or die trying. The assembled fleet continued approaching, and they were maintaining formation. Like a net closing around the throne, and the Concordat speaker broadcast another message saying that any attempt to stop their mission would be met with overwhelming force. Kate Morrison's voice came through on a secure channel, and she said, "The Earth Defense Force had mobilized every available ship, and they were jumping to Lisa's location, and it would take them 2 hours. To arrive, Lisa wanted to tell Kate to stay away and to save those ships for defending humanity's remaining colonies, but she knew the Admiral would not listen, and humans had never been good at abandoning their own, even when it was the smart tactical. Choiskalith placed her glowing hands on the throne's central crystal and closed her eyes, and her entire body began to shine with light as she accessed the precursor programming that had been hidden in her genetic memory for millions of years. She said the code is old and complex and written in mathematics that do not follow normal rules, and she could read it, but changing it would require precision beyond what she alone could manage ever. Thunax moved closer and wrapped his massive form around both Kelith and the crystal, and he said dragons were made to channel cosmic forces, and he could stabilize the energy flows, but he could not direct them. Lisa understood what they needed, and she opened a link to Maya and said, "Start sending me everything you can find about quantum entanglement and reality manipulation and crystalline computing structures." Maya's voice came back shaking with stress, and she said, "I am not a programmer, and I study dead civilizations, not active technology." Lisa said, "You are the smartest person I know, and right now you are all we have, so please help me save everyone." There was silence for 3 seconds, and then Maya said, "Okay, and give me access to your sensor feeds, and I will start mapping the throne's architecture." Throne continued to crack, and energy was bleeding out faster now, and Lisa could see through the fractures to something underneath that looked like raw spacetime being torn apart. The assembled fleet opened fire, but not at Lisa's position, and they were shooting at each other. Lisa watched in confusion as 3 of the organic ships broke formation and turned on their own fleet, and explosions bloomed across the void. The Concordat speaker's voice came through again, but this time it sounded different and less unified, and it said, "There is disagreement among the coalition, and some believe the humans' attempt should be allowed to proceed." Another voice interrupted, and this one was harsh and angry, and it said, "Allowing humans to tamper with the throne is madness, and they will doom us all." Third voice that sounded like wind chimes said, "Perhaps doom is already here, and we must choose between certain death and possible survival." The fleet split into 2 groups, and they began fighting each other in earnest, and Lisa realized that the ancient coalition was fracturing under the weight of fear and desperation. Kate Morrison's voice came through, and she said, "Earth's forces were arriving early, and they had pushed their engines beyond safety limits, and now dozens of human ships dropped out of hyperspace right into the middle of the battle." Admiral Morrison broadcast on all frequencies, and she said any ship that fired on Lisa's position would be considered hostile to humanity and would be engaged immediately. One of the assembled factions ignored the warning and launched a missile swarm toward the throne, and human fighters screamed forward to intercept in the space between became a wall of fire, and Daybrecht and Helen Price of the destroyer Defiant took a direct hit to her bridge, but she kept her ship on course and rammed it straight into the reactor core of an assembled dreadnought, and both vessels exploded in a flash that temporarily blinded everyone. Commander Ryan Foster coordinated the smaller human ships into formations that confused the assembled targeting systems, and he used humanity's one advantage, which was unpredictability and willingness to try tactics that no sane military would attempt. Maya's the voice came through Lisa's earpiece, and she said, "I have the architecture mapped, and I am sending you the data now. But there is a problem." Lisa asked what kind of problem, while simultaneously trying to process the flood of information Maya was dumping Into her systems, Maya said, the throne is designed to judge species based on their approach to power and authority. But there is no option in the code for rejection, and your refusal created a logic trap that the system cannot resolve. Lisa said so. We need to add a new option, Maya said. Exactly. But the throne's code is locked, and we would need administrative access from the SEO. Precursors themselves to change it. Keleth spoke without opening her eyes, and her voice sounded strained, and she said, the precursors are gone, but they left back doors in their creations, because even they knew that perfect systems could fail. She said the back door required something the precursors never expected to see, and it required 3 different species working together with complete trust and shared purpose. Everthonix rumbled and said, trust is not something easily given between species who have only just met. Lisa said, we do not have time for easy, and we either trust each other right now, or we all die. Together, Cleith opened her eyes, and they were blazing brighter than Lisa had ever seen, and she said, then, we begin. She guided Lisa's consciousness back into direct contact with the throne's systems, and this time, Maya's analytical framework came. With her and Vorthanax's power flowed through both of them like a river of living energy. Issa saw the precursor code from the inside, and it was beautiful and terrifying and more complex than anything humanity had ever created, and she understood why the ancient species had never been able to change it. But she also saw the patterns and the repeating structures and the mathematical relationships that held everything together, and with Maya's help, she began to understand the language. Maya's voice came through not as sound but as pure thought, and she said the core function is assessment and judgment, but we can add a parallel function that allows for cooperative stewardship. Lisa asked how. Maya said, we rewrite the win condition, and instead of looking for one worthy species, we make the throne recognize that worthiness comes from collaboration. Calith added her own understanding, and she showed them where the precursor backdoor was hidden, and it required simultaneous input from 3 different types of consciousness, and human and ethel and dragon working in perfect synchronization. The throne's structure shook harder. The cracks were spreading to the pathways that connected to star systems, and Lisa knew they had minutes at most before the collapse became unstoppably. Inside, the battle raged, and more human ships were dying, but they were taking assembled vessels with them, and Admiral Morrison's voice cut through the chaos, saying, hold the line and give Lisa whatever time she needs. Lisa felt the weight of every life depending on her success, and for a moment the pressure was too much, and she thought about giving up. Then Keleth's presence wrapped around her consciousness, and the elf woman said, do not falter. Now, and we have come too far to fail. Vorthanix's power surged through them, and he said, dragons do not know how to quit. Lisa took what felt like a breath, even though she was not in her physical body anymore, and she said, then let us show this ancient machine what 3 species can do when they work together. They began rewriting the code, and Lisa handled the logical structures because human minds were good at finding creative solutions, and Keleth provided the deep understanding of cosmic laws. Because the Ethel had studied reality itself for millions of years, and Vorthanax channeled the raw energy needed to make the changes permanent, because dragons were made of the same fundamental forces that held the universe together. The throne fought them and its defensive systems tried to reject their modifications, but they pushed through because stopping meant death for everyone. Maya fed them calculations in real time and adjusted their approach when something did not work, and she was simultaneously monitoring the structural integrity of the entire system and warning them when they were about to trigger secondary collapses. Lisa lost track of time and could not tell. They had been working for seconds or hours, and her sense of self began to blur with Keleth and Vorthanax until she was not sure where she ended and they began. Then suddenly something clicked into place, and the code accepted their changes, and the throne stopped cracking. The entire structure went dark for 3 full seconds, and in that darkness, Lisa felt every consciousness in the galaxy hold its breath. Then the throne came back online, but different and transformed. A crystal pathways still connected to every star system, but now instead of pathways of judgment, they were pathways of sharing, and the throne was no longer looking for one worthy species to rule it. become a neutral archive and a repository of knowledge accessible to all species and incapable of granting power, but freely offering wisdom to anyone who asked. The change rippled out across the galaxy at faster than light speed, and every species that was connected to the throne's network felt it and understood what had happened. The assembled fleet stopped fighting, and their ships hung motionless in space as they processed what Lisa and her companions had done. The Concordat speaker's voice came through, and it sounded different now and almost awed. Lisa spent 3 weeks in medical care after the transformation of the throne because connecting her consciousness directly to ancient technology had done things to her neural pathways that doctors did not fully understand, and they kept her under observation while her brain slowly returned to normal human patterns. During that time, the galaxy changed in ways both obvious and subtle. Assembled coalition fractured completely, with some species accepting the new reality and others retreating to their home systems in anger and confusion, and 3 of the ancient factions actually declared war on each other over disagreements about what the throne's transformation meant for their standing in the galactic hierarchy. But there were also species that approached humanity with curiosity rather than hostility, and they wanted to understand how such a young civilization had accomplished what millions of years of history said was impossible. Plausible stayed on Earth at Lisa's request, and the elf woman seemed almost relieved to finally have a purpose that was not just guarding secrets and watching emptiness, and she began working with Maya and other human scientists to translate ethel knowledge into forms that humans could understand. And Yusuf Orthonax returned to the dragon clans, and when he told them what had happened, they initially did not believe him, because dragons had spent eons believing their purpose was to hide the throne and protect it from those who would misuse it. But the throne itself confirmed Vorthanax's story and the dragon clans held a gathering that had not occurred in 50,000 years, and they debated for days about what their new purpose should be now that their ancient duty was fulfilled. Some dragons chose to remain isolated, and others decided to explore the galaxy they had helped protect, and a few even approached human colonies and offered to share their knowledge of dimensional navigation in exchange for human art and music and stories. Because dragons apparently had a weakness for creative expression, was promoted to captain and given command of a new ship called the Pathfinder, and her mission was to be humanity's primary liaison with the species that were now approaching Earth with diplomatic intentions. Admiral Morrison told her that humanity needed someone who understood the ancient powers and who had proven they could work with non-human species, and who was stubborn enough to stand up to beings that thought they were superior. Lisa accepted the position but insisted that Maya be assigned as her chief science officer, and Admiral Morrison agreed, because Maya's knowledge of xenarchaeology had become suddenly very relevant to everyday operations in Lisa's first official mission. She was sent to mediate a dispute between 2 former assembled species who were fighting over access to one of the throne's archive nodes, and when she arrived, she found that both sides had brought military fleets and were threatening to restart conflicts that had been dormant for millennia. She listened to both sides present their cases, and their arguments were complex and rooted in historical grievances that went back further than human civilization existed, and they both insisted they had the rightful claim to the archive. Lisa asked them a simple question, and she said, "Why do you need exclusive access when the throne is designed to share information freely with everyone?" They both looked at her like she had said something ridiculous, and one of them explained that obviously the species with greater historical claims should have priority access and control over who else could use the Pertivalis. I said that was exactly the kind of thinking that led to the throne war in the first place, and then she did something neither species expected. She contacted the throne directly through the neural interface that still lingered from her transformation of it, and she asked the throne to make all its archives equally accessible to any species that approached with genuine desire for knowledge, and to refuse access to anyone seeking exclusive control. The throne accepted her suggestion and implemented it immediately across all its nodes. Both fleets were furious, and they demanded to know by what authority Lisa could make such decisions, and she said she had no authority, and she just asked the throne what it thought was fair, and it agreed with her. One of the fleet commanders said this was unacceptable, and humanity was too young to be making decisions that affected ancient species, Lucha looked at him with the same defiance she had shown the throne itself. And she said then, maybe ancient species should learn to make better decisions. The other commander actually laughed and said humanity's arrogance was remarkable for such a young civilization. Lisa said it was not arrogance, and it was just refusing to be impressed by age, when age clearly had not led to wisdom. The two species left without resolving their dispute, but they also did not start shooting at each other, and Lisa counted that as a win over the following months. Lisa mediated 17 more disputes and explored 12 new star systems and made first contact with 4 species that had been isolating themselves since the throne were ended. She also visited New Seattle, where memorials had been built for the colonists who died during the assembled attacks, and she stood in front of those memorials and wondered if those people would think her actions had been worth the cost. Morrison found her there and said the people who died did not die because of Lisa's choices, and they died because the assembled chose fear over patience. Said she still felt responsible. Said good, and that meant she understood the weight of command, and she should carry that weight but not let it crush her back on Earth. Maya made a breakthrough in understanding ethobiology, and she discovered that Keleth was not the last of her species, and there were genetic samples stored in various archives across the galaxy, and with enough work it might be possible to rebuild the SL population. Keleth cried when Maya told her, and Lisa had never seen the elf woman show that much emotion before. Keleth said she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what hope felt like. Maya said loneliness was something humans understood well, and that was why they were so determined to help the project to restore the Ethel. Became a joint effort between dozens of species, and even some of the more hostile former assembled members contributed resources. Because apparently even ancient grudges could be set aside when faced with the possibility of bringing an extinct civilization back from oblivion. Lisa watched all of this unfold. She realized that the throne's transformation had done more than just prevent a war, and it had given the galaxy a reason to work together instead of competing. Species that had been enemies for millions of years were now sharing research and resources and knowledge. Because the throne offered something more valuable than power, and it offered understanding, not everyone was happy with the changes, and there were still conflicts. And some species refused to accept that humanity had any right to influence galactic affairs, and terrorist attacks targeted human colonies and diplomatic vessels. But for every attack, there were 10 species that reached out with offers of cooperation. In trade and friendship, Admiral Morrison established the Galactic Relations Council with representatives from 30 different species, and the council's purpose was to manage disputes peacefully and coordinate responses to threats that affected multiple civilizations. Lisa was asked to serve on the council, but she refused because she said she was better at solving problems in the field than sitting in meetings. She continued flying the Pathfinder with Maya and a crew that was half human and half various other species, and they went wherever they were needed and solved problems through a combination of diplomacy and occasionally creative rule-breaking. Clath joined them permanently, and she said guarding an empty prison had been lonely, but traveling with friends who valued her knowledge rather than fearing her past was something worth living for. For Forvanax visited occasionally, and he would materialize in the cargo bay and complain that humans made terrible tea, but their music was surprisingly moving, and then he would stay for days telling stories about the galaxy before humans existed, 1 year after the throne's transformation. Lisa returned to the location where it had all started, and she found the throne's central structure surrounded by hundreds of ships from dozens of species, and they were all peacefully accessing the archives and sharing what they learned. She contacted the throne and asked it a question that had been bothering her since the beginning. She asked why it had really chosen humanity. The throne responded not with words, but with a vision, and it showed her something the ancient precursors had hidden in its deepest code. The throne was not designed to find a worthy species, and it was designed to find a species that would break it. The precursors knew their creation would become a trap that held the galaxy in stagnation, and so they built in a test that would only be passed by a species curious enough and stubborn enough and collaborative enough to refuse the game entirely. Humanity had not won despite being young and reckless and messy. Humanity had won because they were young and reckless, and messy the throne showed her that every ancient species had approached it with certainty. And they knew they were worthy, and they demanded recognition. Humans approached it with questions, and they asked why, and they wanted to understand before they accepted that difference was everything. Lisa sat in her captain's chair and processed this revelation, and she realized the precursors had been remarkably clever, or possibly was very tired of watching species fight over nothing.